Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Cropper here. I'd like to announce the beginning of a series on American history. This is going to sort of intertwine in some ways with the series on capitalism that I started on Cropper B, which I will be resuming with, I believe, part 10 in a series eventually. But for now, I'm going to begin the series on American history with some excerpts from Benjamin Franklin's autobiography. And of course you know that an autobiography means it was written by the individual, whereas a biography is just written about the individual by somebody. You knew that. Benjamin Franklin was born in 1706 and died in 1790. He was a man of many roles: a printer, an author, philosopher, scientist, inventor, diplomat, politician, only to name a few. He lived a wide and varied life and found himself at the center of virtually every major event involving America during the second half of the 18th century. He was so successful as a businessman that he was able to retire at the age of 42. He proved equally adept at science, and his experiments in electricity made him the most famous American in the colonies. Politics and diplomacy occupied him for most of the later half of his life. So let us begin. Now, this is addressed to his son. He starts this off as being addressed to his son, and then he just says, generally, my recollections may have some value for anybody young. And for the first few pages, he talks about his family history, and where his grandfather came from, where his mother came from, and all that, which I think is not important. So then he talks about when he was about, I believe, 10 years old. We'll find out here in just a minute. He got put as an apprentice into a trade, to learn a trade. Let's just go from there. My elder brothers were all apprentices to different trades. I was put to the grammar school at 8 years of age, my father intending to devote me, as the tithe of his sons, to the service of the church. My early readiness in learning to read, which must have been very early, as I do not remember when I could not read, and the opinion of all his friends that I should certainly make a good scholar, encouraged him in this purpose of his life. My Uncle Benjamin, too, approved of it, and proposed to give me his shorthand volumes of sermons to set up with if I would learn his shorthand. I continued, however, at the grammar school rather less than a year, though in that time I had risen gradually from the middle of the class of that year to be at the head of the same class, and was removed into the next class, whence I was to be placed in the third at the end of the year. Very unlike the modern hero Einstein, who wasn't able to tie his shoes in third grade. But my father, burdened with a numerous family, was unable, without inconvenience, to support the expense of a college education. Considering, moreover, as he had said to one of his friends in my presence, the little encouragement that line of life afforded to those educated for it, he gave up his first intentions, took me from the grammar school, and sent me to a school for writing and arithmetic, kept by a then famous man, Mr. George Brownell. He was a skillful master and succeeded in his profession, employing the mildest and most encouraging methods. Under him I learned to write a good hand pretty soon, but I failed entirely in arithmetic. At 10 years old I was taken to help my father in his business, which was that of tallow chandler and soap boiler, a business to which he was not bred, but had assumed on his arrival in New England, because he found that his dyeing trade, being in little request, would not maintain his family. Accordingly, I was employed in cutting wicks for the candles, filling the molds for cast candles, attending the shop, going of errands, etc. And I disliked the trade, and had a strong inclination to go to sea, but my father declared against it. But, residing near the water, I was much in it, and on it I learned to swim well, and to manage boats, and when embarked with other boys I was commonly allowed to govern, especially in any case of difficulty, and upon other occasions I was generally the leader among the boys, and sometimes led them into scrapes. Then it tells about how him and some of his friends took a bunch of rocks and made a little pier out into this little mucky thing so that they could always get out there to fish. and he got in trouble because they were actually not his rocks. His father made them undo it all. Anyways, so we'll skip that. Now he talks a little bit about his father. He says, at his table, he liked to have, at the dinner table in his home, Benjamin Franklin's father liked to have, as often as he could, some sensible friend or neighbor to converse with, and always took care to start some ingenious or useful topic of discourse, which might tend to improve the minds of his children. By this means, he turned our attention to what was good, just, and prudent in the conduct of our lives. And that's a little digression, and he goes a little further into some other stuff about his parents. But then he says, to return, I continued thus employed in my father's business for 2 years. That is, till I was 12 years old. And my brother John, who was bred to that business, having left my father, married and set up for himself at Rhode Island. There was every appearance that I was destined to supply his place and become a tallow chandler. But my dislike to the trade continuing, my father had apprehensions that if he did not put me to one or more agreeable, I should break loose and go to sea, as my brother Josiah had done, to his great vexation. In consequence, he took me to walk with him, to see joiners, bricklayers, turners, braziers, etc., at their work, that he might observe my inclination, and endeavor to fix it on some trade or profession that would keep me on land. It has ever since been a pleasure to me to see good workmen handling their tools, and it has been often useful to me to have learned much by it, as to be able to do some trifling jobs in the house when a workman was not at hand, and to construct little machines for my experiments at the moment, when the intention of making these was warm in my mind. Let me skip down a little here. From my infancy, I was passionately fond of reading, and all the money that came into my hands was laid out in the purchasing of books. I was very fond of voyages. My first acquisition was Bunyan's work in separate little volumes. I afterwards sold them to enable me to buy R. Burton's historical collections. They were small chapmen's books, and cheap, 40 volumes in all. My father's little library consisted chiefly of books on polemic divinity, most of which I read. I have often regretted that at a time when I had such a thirst for knowledge, more proper books had not fallen in my way, since it was resolved I should not be bred to divinity. There was among them Plutarch's Lives, which I read abundantly, and I still think that time spent to great advantage. There was also a book, Defoe's, called An Essay on Projects, and another of Dr. Mather's called An Essay to Do Good, which perhaps gave me a turn of thinking that had an influence on some of the principal future events in my life. This bookish inclination at length determined my father to make me a printer, although he had already one son, James, of that profession. In 1717, my brother James returned from England with a press and letters to set up his business in Boston. I liked it much better than that of my father, but still had a hankering for the sea. To prevent the apprehended effect of such an inclination, my father was impatient to have me bound to my brother. I stood out some time, but at last was persuaded and signed the indenture when I was but yet 12 years old. An indentured servant at 12 years of age. I was to serve an apprenticeship till I was 21 years of age, 9 years. Only I was to be allowed a journeyman's wage during the last year. In a little time I made a great progress in the business and became a useful hand to my brother. I now had access to better books. An acquaintance with the apprentices of booksellers enabled me sometimes to borrow a small one, which I was careful to return soon and clean. Often I sat up in my chamber reading the greatest part of the night when the book was borrowed in the evening, to be returned in the morning, lest it should be found missing.